Welcome to meeting number 10 of the House of Commons Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. Pursuant to the order of reference of July 20, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study on Canada-China relations. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference. Voici quelques règles à respecter pour assurer le bon.
Here are a few rules about this meeting. For this video conference, interpretation services will be afforded for all the meeting. At the bottom of your screen, you can choose either English or French. When you are given the floor, if you want to go from one language to the other, you have to choose your channel of interpretation so that your speech is in the language you've chosen. It would be appropriate for you to pause when you pass from one language to the other. When you're ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone. I would remind you that all members and witnesses speeches must be addressed to the chair. If you want to speak out of your turn, you activate your microphone to say that you need to do a call to order. And you ought to mention to the chair that you want to speak. When the list appears at the bottom of the screen next to your name, you'll see an option that allows you for raising your hand. Make sure that you speak clearly and slowly. When you're not given the floor, please turn your microphone off. The utilization of a headset is recommended.
On their screen in the top right-hand corner, ensure they are on gallery view. With this view, you should be able to see all the participants in a grid view. It will ensure that all video participants can see one another. As is the case during in-person meetings, the public will only see the participant who is speaking. I'd now like to welcome our first panel of witnesses from Alliance Canada Hong Kong. We have Sherry, I think it is, Wong, Executive Director, and David Wong, Director, Youth Engagement and Policy Initiatives of ACHK. From the Canada-Hong Kong link, we have Gloria Fung, President and Coordinator of Canada-wide platform for 16 organizations concerned about Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong Watch, we have Aileen Calvary, co-founder and trustee. Each witness or organization will have 7 to 10 minutes to make an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from the members. Will Ms. Wong or Mr. Wong be starting on behalf of Alliance Canada? Whichever of you is, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is David Wong, and I'm the Director of Youth Engagement and Policy Initiative of ACHK, and the former President of the Hong Kong University Students' Union, HKUSU, until I fled Hong Kong. I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to testify. I understand my privilege as a Canadian Hong Konger, and it is my duty to speak up. Though I'm speaking to you as a Canadian citizen, I am at risk. The Hong Kong government has already issued warrants for 6 overseas advocates for secession and colluding with foreign countries under the national security law, one of which is an American citizen advocating to their own government. The national security law destroys Hong Kongers' capacity to express opposing opinions. It is also used to disqualify candidates and hijack the electoral election. My friends and activists are feeling the chilling effect under this draconian law. Hong Kongers now depend on the international allies to hold Beijing and Hong Kong government to account. I'd like to bring the committee a year back, when I was still a student leader involving in the pro-democracy movement. At that time, I had been harassed, threatened, and intimidated. On August 30th, 2019, I was being followed, beaten up, and wounded by a man in white t-shirt, and that was the dress code known for pro-Beijing thugs. 3 other activists were brutally attacked on the same day. I didn't go to a hospital after the attack. Hospitals are dangerous spaces for activists, as it was exposed that the police set up backdoors to the hospital's authorities' system to track down hospitalized protesters. At the time, HKUSU even had to set up an underground clinic with voluntary doctors and medical students for protesters who are in need for medical help. I also didn't seek help from the police. Why would I? As an activist, the police sees me as an enemy. I've witnessed their abuse of power and human rights violation. I've witnessed mass arrest. 1 in 10 of my friends have been arrested on bogus charges. I've carried a friend who was shot in the stomach by the police. I've had guns pointed at me, and I still vividly remember the smell of tear gas. The Hong Kong police force arrests medics and reporters. Protesters were beaten, raped, tortured, and denied due process. You know what my friends and I would carry to the protests? Our wills, because we fear that we will never see the sunlight again. After the attack, I immediately booked my ticket at 3 p.m. and hopped on the plane at 7. I knew fleeing Hong Kong was a one-way trip, but I still naively believed that I might still have a slight chance to return. And the national security law killed it. Our advocacy work here can get us arrested under the broad definition of collusion with foreign countries. We're not safe even in Canada, as we have seen dissidents abducted by Beijing in other countries. The fear is real. Regarding a national security law, Beijing's claim of extraterritorial jurisdiction over acts committed by non-Hong Kong residents outside of the territory is amplifying Beijing's global authoritarian ambition. This committee should also pay attention to Beijing's long arms and the interference that is already effectively undermining our freedoms in Canada. While I'm not an expert in national security, I witnessed their tactics, especially in the academia and student activism. The Liaison Office was a major financial supporter of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association in Hong Kong universities. HKUSU was also once infiltrated by students trained by pro-Beijing groups. We worry that this kind of interference is already happening in Canada. Hong Kong's freedom and autonomy have been destroyed. Journalists are guarding the last remnants of freedom of press and information. But the owner of Apple Daily, one of the most reliable sources in Hong Kong, was arrested under the national security law 2 days ago. The situation is urgent, and we're running out of time. I asked Canada to immediately offer safe haven for Hong Kongers, to curb the CCP's malicious interference at home, and to work with our allies to hold the Chinese and Hong Kong government to account. Thank you again for letting me share my experience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Was Ms. Wong going to add or not? I guess not. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I will. I will
okay.
be adding to
Okay, so you still have a few minutes, of course. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sherry Wong. I use she, her pronouns. I was born in Canada and raised in the post-handover Hong Kong, so I'm honored to be here today as a Hong Konger and as a Canadian. I am the co-founder and executive director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong. ACHK is a volunteer-led, multi-partisan national collective of 18 community groups across 10 cities. Since the start of Hong Kong's democratic movement, I have received death and rape threats with implications to harm my family. During the launch week of ACHK, I received an ominous phone call to my hotel room saying they're coming to collect me. The room was booked by another person, and yet they still managed to find me. On October 1st, 2019, I co-led a protest on Parliament Hill with Ottawans Stand with Hong Kong. And days before the demonstration, we started to receive online threats. At the protest, we were verbally and physically assaulted, threatened, and harassed. Over 100 pro-Beijing supporters were mobilized quickly and surrounded us and kettled us. While the Ottawa police were called to escort us, pro-Beijing groups took photo and videos of us and continued to follow us even as we drove away. And after the protests, many of us, our private information was maliciously published. Canadians across the nation are forced to hide their identity or be targeted by pro-Beijing forces. And what's even more worrying, these interference campaigns are emboldened by Chinese diplomats in Canada. Tong Xiaoling, the Consul General in Vancouver, has called on an ethno-nationalistic unity as an attempt to assert control over the Sino communities. Hong Kong is not only a foreign issue, which is why our demands are not only about advancing for Hong Kong's democratic future. It also reflects the ongoing issues facing Canadian communities. Along Citizen Press Conference, we consulted with 13,000 Canadians and Hong Kongers through a survey to inform Canada's 5 demands of action. 1. Provide humanitarian support to Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Chinese, and other communities fleeing persecution. 2. Invoke sanction against Chinese and Hong Kong officials for human rights atrocities. 3. Protect Canadians' constitutional rights and freedoms from erosion. 4. Investigate and combat foreign interference into Canadian institutions. And 5. End all export of military police goods and technology. While we commend the decision to suspend the sensitive military exports to Hong Kong, Canadian education institutions continue to be in a vulnerable position for trading funds for intellectual properties. 3 Canadian universities are in the top 10 in collaborating with the People's Liberation Army: McGill University, University of Waterloo, and University of Toronto. Foreign state interference is deeply rooted in various aspects of Canadian society, including academia, media, social media, student communities, the private sector, education, and political institutions. It's become clear that there's a coordinated campaign to infiltrate and influence Canadian society, and this is part of the CCP's global authoritarian agenda. There is overwhelming support in Canada to stand against human rights atrocities, co-signed by 27 community leaders and 75 parliamentarians from all major political parties. We are calling on the government to invoke Magnitsky sanctions in collaboration with other middle powers. The CCP has shown complete disregard for international rules. State suppression has only accelerated under the guise of COVID-19. And since the implementation of the national security law, the CCP is using oppressive tactics that are used in Tibet and East Turkestan. Notably, on the first day of the national security law, authorities have started to collect DNA from those who are arrested in Hong Kong. There's a persistent characterization that Hong Kongers readily have the resources to immigrate and that protesters are young. In reality, many of them do not have the material means to leave and may not qualify through regular pathways. We have a short window to act before the CCP completely shuts down the freedom of movement in Hong Kong. As for Canada's role in democratic movement in Hong Kong, I hope you can all agree. The democratic future must be of the people, by the people, and for the people of Hong Kong. Before wrapping up, I want to acknowledge the narrative that the CCP has created, an illusion of net benefits when trading with China, and it is naive to believe they will change. Time and again, the CCP has used trade as a weapon, and it is absolutely crucial that Canada begins diversifying our trade and economic relations with countries that are committed to democratic development and upholding human rights. Thank you again for inviting me to speak here today. I look forward to your questions, and I hope we can offer insights to advance Canada's interests in this larger discussion about Canada-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong and Ms. Wong. Now from the Canada-Hong Kong link, we have Gloria Y. Fung, President and Coordinator of Canada-wide Platform for 16 Organizations Concerned about Hong Kong. Ms. Fung, you have up to 10 minutes. Please go ahead. Oh, please unmute. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and members of the Special Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee. I feel honored to stand with the courageous people of Hong Kong in the struggle for freedom and human rights. I'm a proud Canadian who grew up in Hong Kong. I've been engaged in international justice work here since Canada-Hong Kong Link's formation in 1997. Last year, when I saw millions in Hong Kong peacefully marching for basic civil rights and young frontline protesters courageously standing their ground despite being tear gas, pepper spray, and even shot, it touched my heart. I know how hard it is in China to overcome one's fear and stand up for human dignity and fundamental rights, because I was a witness of the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. I saw tanks crushing people and a man shot to death beside me. I will never underestimate the brutality of the Chinese Communist Party in silencing dissent. In Hong Kong, during last year's protest marked by escalating police brutality, over 9,000 people were arrested, some as young as 13 years old. They face prison terms of up to 10 years. This is the price they have to pay for struggling to preserve core values that we can two-system framework. As Beijing imposes new security law and crackdown on independent media and opposition, many in Hong Kong fear they would suffer the same fate as the millions of interned Uyghurs, Tibetans, and faith groups whose rights of free expression and worship are denied. In addition to threatening the civil rights of Hong Kong people and the 300,000 Canadians living there, the national security law claims extraterritorial jurisdiction. Anyone, anywhere in the world who criticizes the Chinese or Hong Kong governments could be considered a criminal under its vaguely worded provision criminalizing the incitement of hatred against China. China has extradition treaties with many countries, and Canadian citizenship offers no protection. The two Michaels can attest to this as they mark their 20 months of arbitrary detention under conditions amounting to torture. Our government must take this grave threat to Canadian safety seriously. Approximately 50 Hong Kongers are seeking asylum in Canada. We anticipate a new wave of returned immigrants and asylum seekers after travel restrictions are lifted. So what is the impact of Hong Kong on Canadian community? What is happening in Hong Kong is vital to Canadian interests, as an increasingly powerful Chinese regime aims to expand its influence and subvert the international rule of law. Hong Kong is on the front lines of a worldwide conflict pitting totalitarianism against freedom and democracy. Therefore, defending freedom in Hong Kong is also defending Canadian security, interests, and core values. Last June, Canada-Hong Kong Link staged our first anti-extradition bill rally, engaging a wide range of communities, including the Uyghur, Tibetan, Taiwanese, and religious sectors. Canadian support for Hong Kong grew into large demonstrations involving thousands from coast to coast, following the launch of an e-petition supporting democracy and human rights in Hong Kong with thousands of signatories from across Canada. We have collectively built a nationwide network of organizations engaging voters to advocate for policy changes. However, the Chinese Communist Party has launched covert operations to suppress our right to freedom of expression, using commercial blacklisting, threatening phone calls or emails, cyber hacking, and even physical confrontation. I have personally experienced all these forms of intimidation. Anonymous callers have repeatedly warned me of serious consequences if I continue my advocacy. Google security had warned me of numerous state-level hacking attempts. The most dramatic physical confrontations occurred in August last year. Chinese international students and pro-Beijing United Front organizations were mobilized to block and intimidate peaceful demonstrations in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, and many other cities around the world during the same time. In Toronto, they blocked our march and attempted to steal our flags, leading to police intervention. They screamed insults at us, sang the Chinese national anthem, and booed us when we responded with "O Canada." Older men with cellular phones stood apart from the crowd, apparently giving instructions. At the Vancouver church, a prayer vigil for peace in Hong Kong was disrupted by 100 pro-Beijing protesters waving Chinese flags. Church members had to call police so they could leave safely. These incidents are a clash of opposing values. We have documented them in the 2020 National Report of Harassment and Intimidation compiled by Amnesty International and the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China. Pro-Beijing United Front organizations have placed full-page ads in Chinese language newspapers in Canada, supporting the extradition bill and new security law. In most Canadian Chinese language media, coverage of Hong Kong issues is virtually controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, either through direct ownership or influenced by the Chinese embassy and consulates. Journalistic freedom in Canada is limited. Our proposed actions. In light of Beijing's grievous assault on civil rights in Hong Kong, we call upon the government of Canada to take the following actions. Number one, offer a safe harbor program with an expedited process to grant permanent residency status to Hong Kongers at risk of political persecution, including international students and expatriate workers who have participated in protests in Canada. Number two, invoke the Magnitsky Law to sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials who violate human rights and to ban them and their immediate family members from Canada and freeze their Canadian access. The US has already done this. Number three, introduce legislation to combat foreign influence in Canadian politics and suppression of freedom of expression on Canadian soil. Furthermore, we call on this committee to expedite the completion of the report on Hong Kong after the series of hearings and immediately act on the proposed policies to address the human rights crisis in Hong Kong. In conclusion, Canada needs to work with international allies to institute a strong policy toward China. It is way past time for Canada to show leadership on the world stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fung. And now from Hong Kong Watch, we have Aileen Calverley, co-founder and trustee. Ms. Calverley, you have 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's my honor to speak to you today. Since the national security law came into force on June 30th, it has already been used to suppress freedom of expression and assembly on the streets, in the classroom, and overseas. Over 30 protesters and activists has been arrested. Democracy itself has also been targeted by this new law. The Hong Kong government and Beijing officials in Hong Kong have used the threat of the national security law to quash dissent and undermine democracy by disqualifying 12 pro-democracy candidates who won primaries and threatened over 600,000 Hong Kongers who turned out to vote for them in the primary elections. They then choose to postpone the elections. Our concern now is that by invoking emergency colonial ordinance, Beijing could suspend democracy in Hong Kong indefinitely. The new law is not only limited to quashing opposition at the ballot box or on the street. The introduction of national security education and encouraging students and teachers to monitor each other, as well as the firing of pro-democracy academic Professor Benny Tai, are blows to academic freedom. Similarly, the arrest of Jimmy Lai, the owner of pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily, with 200 police officers, raiding its headquarters is a blow to press freedom. Meanwhile, tech firms like Telegram, Facebook, Google, WhatsApp are in standoff with authority over the requirement that they cooperate with the police data requests in the national security cases. These developments demonstrate the chilling effect the national security law is having on all sectors of Hong Kong society. Recently, the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong launched its inquiry report into human rights abuse by the Hong Kong police force. In direct breach of international humanitarian law, the police arrest a dozen of medical workers who were trying to help injured protesters. This does not only matter to Hong Kongers whose freedom has been stripped away. It matters to us in Canada. With over 900,000 Hong Kong Canadians living in Canada and Hong Kong, Canada has a special relationship with Hong Kong. If Canada, with its long history of defending human rights, is not willing to stand with like-minded partners in defense of Hong Kong's freedom, then those values that we believe in will be degraded along with Canada's standing in the world. The announcement by the Beijing government of a list of individuals overseas wanted under the national security law validates the authority warring claim to oversee jurisdiction, its ability to target foreign nationals, and the fact that the law will be applied retrospectively. As we have large Hong Kong Canadian community in Canada, it is extremely concerning that 6 Hong Kong activists living in the UK, Germany, and the US were all wanted under the law. One of the activists in question is a US citizen and who has been living in the US for over 25 years. These activists are accused of inciting secession, colluding with foreign forces. The maximum penalty is lifelong imprisonment. But the law also harms Canada's business interests in the region. A recent report published by Hong Kong Watch on why Hong Kong matters found that the city as a financial center continues to be indispensable to be Chinese and international business, precisely because of the one country, two system model that guarantees freedoms and the rule of law. Hong Kong remains the most important financial conduit between China and the rest of the world, and a key hub for Canadian businesses. Strip away the city's rule of law, one of Asia's most important hubs will collapse. China must step back from the blame. Before turning to what we should do, we must dispel a myth. It is often said that China is Canada's second largest trading partner, and Canada cannot afford to upset China. But let's look at the numbers. In 2019, Canada's export to China were 3.9% in total. Canada does not rely on China. The biggest trading partner of Canada is, of course, the United States, with 75% of Canadian export going to the US. The second largest trading partner of Canada is European Union. A recent report published by Henry Jackson Society found that among the Five Eyes countries, Canada is least reliant on China as an export market. The Canadian government should not hide behind the myth, instead of standing up for its value. Canada is not dependent on China. Canada must found its backbone and stand up to CCP. There are 3 ways to do this: sanctions, diplomacy, and refuge. In response to the violation of the Joint Declaration, the US government last week imposed sanctions on 11 Hong Kong and Chinese officials, including Carrie Lam. This follows the enactment of the Financial Sanction Bill, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which enables the government to sanction individuals and financial institutions that have violated Hong Kong's autonomy. Canada should join them. At Hong Kong Watch, our reasoning of supporting targeted sanctions has always been threefold. First, we recognize that targeting Hong Kong and Chinese officials is a deterrent, ensuring that continued violation of human rights are met with a steep personal price, which includes the restriction of travel and financial penalties. Second, despite the claim of a Chinese official that sanctions will have little personal impact, as he doesn't have a US bank account or travel to the US, we know that they work. One executive with a China unit of a major European bank described all officials on the US sanction list as toxic in the eyes of international banks. This is not to mention, since many of the officials named on the list have family with foreign citizenship, a visa ban would create a considerable obstacle for them. The partner of Secretary for Justice Theresa Jang and the Secretary of Education Evan Young have Canadian citizenship, and the Secretary for Home Affairs, Casper Troy, owns property here in Canada. Third, target sanction fall into wider discussion about the international community's response to the Chinese Communist Party's expansionist strategy. For Hong Kong, it is 5 minutes to midnight. We hope the Canadian government will play its part and have the courage to follow the example set by the US and enact sanctions under the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act in defense of Hong Kong rights and freedoms. For too long, Carrie Lam and CCP officials have been able to act with impunity, suspending freedoms and violating human rights. Of course, Magnitsky sanctions on their own are not the whole answer. They should be part of a wider approach, which includes the offer of a lifeline to Hong Kongers, especially the young protesters who are in need, and the endorsement of the creation of a UN special envoy and a rapporteur for Hong Kong to monitor and report on the situation on the ground. This would cover a comprehensive strategy of diplomacy, refuge, and sanction, which should be the bedrock of Canada's response with international partners to the crisis in Hong Kong. Some who favor placing trade over human rights may argue that these measures will have little effect with Canada undertaking them alone and only serve to antagonize China. However, Canada is not alone. In the last month, we have seen countries across the world suspending extradition treaties with Hong Kong and implementing export control. I'm certain that if Canada chooses to act, it will find itself in close company with its key allies from the free world. It's time to take action. It's time to stand up for Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Calvary, and I thank all the witnesses for staying within their time. And now we'll go to the first round of questions. To start off will be Mr. Jennis for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. And I am so glad that we're finally here and we're finally having these hearings on Hong Kong. I wish we had started these hearings on Hong Kong months ago. We didn't have the support of the government to do that back in May, but this powerful testimony that we're getting, better late than never, will hopefully be a huge wake-up call to all of us here, to parliamentarians, to the government, and to all Canadians. Because we're hearing from witnesses who have a great understanding of Hong Kong, who love Hong Kong, but who first and foremost are proud Canadians and are talking about threats to their rights, their freedom, their sense of security here in Canada. What I get from your testimony are that what we're seeing in Hong Kong is an attack on fundamental human rights, an attack on international law, a violation of China's commitments, but also really this unprecedented effort to formally seek extraterritorial jurisdiction over speech, that the Chinese government now presumes that they can hold people accountable, that they can prosecute people who are Canadian citizens for what they say in Canada. And that should be a huge concern for all of us. So thank you for bringing that testimony. So I want to zero in on some action items. One of the witnesses said that the committee should table a report with some specific recommendations dealing with the issue of Hong Kong. So I'd like to get the feedback other witnesses on proceeding with that. I think, you know, when we see events in Hong Kong, people hear concern, grave concern, and they just get sick of hearing concern and they want to hear the action items. We had some good specific action items, which seem similar across the witnesses. So what I got from that were really four things. Magnitsky sanctions, I think everybody mentioned those. Tough new legislation dealing with foreign interference, preventing Chinese state interference here in Canada, new pathways around immigration, and then proposals around diplomacy. So I guess I'll put my questions together and maybe you can hear from all of the witnesses on them. You know, should we proceed with a report as a committee to put these issues on the parliamentary agenda? On the issue of sanctions, should we sanction Carrie Lam? Is that something that Canada should follow up on? On the issue of foreign interference, it seems obvious to me in a way that we should have a zero tolerance policy for diplomats involved in foreign interference here in Canada, that if you're intimidating Canadians and you're a diplomat, you should be sent home. And that we should end university cooperation with hostile foreign armies. It's crazy to me that we would have cooperation between the People's Liberation Army and our universities. So that those seem like clear, simple steps that the Canadian government could take right away. I'd love to hear the feedback of all of the witnesses on those points.
Well, so if you don't mind, Mr. Dennis, could you help us in terms of expediting this by indicating who you'd like to hear from first? I'm sorry to do that, but I think it would help us all.
Sure. Well, how about we go in reverse order of the testimony then?
Very good. Then Ms. Calverley, please.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I think immediate action is needed. Time is running out. It's very, very dire situation in Hong Kong. So I really agree that to have, actually we have the list, or sanction list. And actually I'm based in the UK, so you may know Hong Kong Watch. We are international human rights NGO, but we based in London. So actually the foreign minister already have this first patch of name to be sanctioned. So, but not including China. So we were pushing the next batch will be including Chinese and Hong Kong official. So definitely I agree with Ghana Janice that Carrie Lam definitely on the list. So I think we need to do that, go ahead. And like what I said, it's very important that we do take action with our key allies. So we are not alone. And of course, like we were laughed by some other people saying that you cannot save your own Canadian. How do you save Hong Kong? I totally disagree with that. I think with international community, we work together. We can save our Canadian. We can also save Hong Kong.
Ms. Calvert, just to get time for the other witnesses, Ms. Fung, if you can comment on my introduction and my questions.
I fully agree with your proposal. I think it is of utmost importance that we need to expedite the completion of this series of hearings report, because we cannot wait until the entire hearings covering all issues of the special committee agenda to be completed, because the risk in Hong Kong that the Hong Kong people are confronted with is so imminent. Even 1 month will be too long. Many of them are already being confronted with life and death risks. And it is of utmost importance for us to work with our allies, particularly the Five Eyes allies, to, number one, to think of some kind of emergency measures to help Hong Kongers that are under very high risk of political persecutions to get out of Hong Kong. And at the same time, we should also implement the safe harbor program to allow those people who are also under political persecution to settle down in Canada. And for those international students, which a lot of people have overlooked, actually, many of them have joined us in the past year in our rallies and all kinds of social actions. They are also under political persecution risk. So they should be provided with some kind of, extended visa for them to stay behind. Yeah.
Ms. Fong, thank you very much. I'm afraid Mr. Jennis's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Jennis. And now Ms. Zan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you so much for the witnesses for coming forward today. I know this is a very emotional issue and a very worrying issue for so many of the people in Hong Kong and for you yourselves and your families. I do want to say I did visit Hong Kong once and found it to be an incredible city, a unique city in the world. And I'm so sorry to see what's going on right now. I want to say observers have warned that the national security law has these extraterritorial reach, as was mentioned, with Amnesty International in particular stating that the law, and I quote, applies to everyone on the planet. So where and to whom do you believe this law applies? And how do the extraterritorial aspects of the law compare to national security provisions adopted in jurisdictions outside China? Mr. Wong, would you like to start with that? And then maybe Ms. Feng?
Please unmute.
Thank you for your question. And yes, the national security law is definitely concerning, and especially about the extraterritorial jurisdiction. And what we can see 2 days ago is that a journalist working for a UK-based press has been arrested in Hong Kong for under the national security law. So what we can see is that even though we have ended extradition arrangement with Hong Kong, Canadians living or even situating in Hong Kong are at risk of being arrested, and even if they're working for Canada-based press. And I think that's what this committee should pay attention to and concern about.
Thank you. Ms. Feng?
Yeah, I think there are a few groups of people who are under the imminent risk under this new security law. Those expatriate people living and working in Hong Kong, including the 300,000 Canadians there. And therefore, Canada has the responsibility to condemn this new security law and at the same time to work with our allies to seek a a certain way to put an end to it. And number two, there are also other international nationals. If they happen to be in transit in Hong Kong, they could also be arbitrarily arrested. So I think it really applies to everyone, anywhere on this planet, including all our members of the special committee today who could have said anything critical towards the Beijing government and also the Hong Kong government. So I think this kind of fear has been very overwhelming. And a lot of people have already started to be affected and exercise self-censorship. And a lot of media people in Hong Kong, international media people in Hong Kong have already been exercising self-censorship, and many of them have also relocated the office to Taiwan or any other neighboring countries. So this is a very, very unfortunate development.
Thank you. So given all of that, to what extent do you believe it would be risky for foreigners who have advocated for greater freedoms and democracy in Hong Kong to visit Hong Kong, the People's Republic of China, or countries that have close relations with China? Who would like to answer that?
So I will answer.
Calvary. Yes.
Yeah. So actually, journalists in Hong Kong, a lot of them, they are waiting for the renewal of the visa. So actually, New York Times, they relocate some of the staff from Hong Kong to South Korea. So you can see that that's a threat for journalists in Hong Kong. And for Hong Kong Watch, our chairman, he was denied entry into Hong Kong, and he got threats, sending letters to his neighbor, to him, and also to his mom. And also, like last week, when Ray Wong, one of the wanted activists, visited London and he met with Simon Zhang, he got the asylum in the UK. They were followed by a guy who looks like a Chinese national. And just yesterday, Simon Zhang received email call from CY Leung that saying, watch out, they will get him and take him back to Hong Kong. So that's the threat for people outside Hong Kong.
Thank you. So what has been the public reaction within Hong Kong to the national security law? I mean, has there been any polling taken? I know this must be very difficult. And how are people in Hong Kong demonstrating their opposition to the law, if at all? I'm sure they must be very worried.
So Citizen Press Conference actually did a survey with 370,000 respondents, and 98% of them do not support the national security law. So we see overwhelming sentiments that this national security law is effectively ending the Constitution and the basic rights of Hong Kong citizens.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zan. Now, just a second, please. And
now we will move to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd really like to sincerely thank all of our witnesses here today for having been with us and to have had the courage to appear at these hearings of this special committee in Canada, because we all realize that this appearance could have an effect on your lives, on your security and safety. And so we very much appreciate your contribution to the committee's proceedings. So thank you once again. There was talk of, it was said by several of the witnesses here today that Canada might receive more Hong Kong nationals. And the question is quite a simple one, given that the political authorities in Hong Kong and the Chinese authorities are very likely to try to prevent any departures of people who are against what's happening in Hong Kong. How could this proposal have a concrete effect, in the full knowledge that we risk preventing people from Hong Kong coming to Canada? Mr. Bergeron, who would you like to answer that? Well, whoever would like to, but perhaps I'll ask it of Madame Fong to start.
A few weeks ago, already, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson has already expressed that they may bar Hong Kong people from departing from Hong Kong. And also, many of the high-profile social activists, such as Mr. Martin Lee, who's considered to be the father of democracy in Hong Kong, even Jimmy Lai, as well as Joshua Wong, etc., their passports have already been confiscated by police in Hong Kong. So there's no way for them to be able to get out of Hong Kong unless there's collaboration among like-minded allies to provide a special tunnel in Hong Kong for them to get out, just like what happened right after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. A lot of those social activists from mainland China, when they arrive in Hong Kong, actually through a collaboration among different embassies in Hong Kong, they managed to get out of Hong Kong. So I think this is one way that Canada can consider. So the collaboration with other, allies in Hong Kong is of utmost importance. And the other possibility is that I think before anyone's passport is going to be confiscated, it is also important for us to offer them the safe harbor program so that they can also get out of Hong Kong as soon as possible. If they wish, they can stay here or at least temporarily or even seeking residency.
Mr. Wong, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I'd just like to add on to what Ma'am Fong just mentioned, because she already covered a situation for well-known and high-profile activists. But I can also explain a little bit about how Hong Kong government can practically prevent someone from departing from Hong Kong. So basically, to confiscate one's passport in Hong Kong, there are two conditions right now, normally or most commonly. The first one is a bail condition when someone has been arrested, and the second one is that if they are being investigated under a national security law, the new national security law also granted the police agency a right to confiscate their passport. But at the same time, I'd like to draw committee attention to actually a lot of non-high profile activists who may not have their passport confiscated yet, but they have no financial or material means to leave Hong Kong or resettle in Canada. And we can actually, by amending our existing program to lower the time barrier and also other requirement barrier, to allow them to quickly and also in time to resettle in Canada. Thank you.
Je crois qu'il y avait Madame Wong.
I think Madame Wong wanted to say something as well. Ms.
Thank you. So what is recommended here is not only about a refugee pathways, because outside of refugee pathways, we still have immigration pathways, we still have education pathways, we still have employment pathways for foreigners to come to Canada. I think our urgent situation is looking at all the options that are available for Hong Kongers to take, identify those barriers, and address those barriers on a larger basis. So we don't necessarily have to create a new strategy. We just have to look at what exists now and how can we use that system most effectively. And I think adding to what Davin has mentioned, most people, regular people, have not necessarily have their passports taken. They still have a limited freedom of movement at the moment. So the window is closing fast, and I think any action will be better.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Fong.
Thank you very much, Madame Fong. Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Harris for 6 minutes. Please unmute. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. It's an act of courage, particularly for Mr. Wong, who himself described quite strongly for us the consequences and his own circumstances in Hong Kong, and thank you for pointing it out to us. Thank you also for letting us know, and I think through us all Canadians know, Ms. Fong, that we ourselves are affected by this law, and they purport to cover any Canadian or any foreigner who speaks out in the way that they consider is contrary to this national law. So it underscores the importance to this. Canada, in 1997, along with other countries, promised and pledged to, when there was the 1997 agreement was made place, we pledged to do our utmost to promote the continuing rule of law in Hong Kong and the autonomy of its institutions. That was over 20 years ago. And I guess if I can ask Ms. Fong, are you aware of any serious work been done in the last 20 years to promote this, or are we now dealing with something that we've allowed to get to this point? Ms. Fong?
Sorry, please unmute.
Yeah, you're muted there.
Could you repeat the question again? Because just now this, I have difficulty in hearing your question.
Oh, well, I will repeat it quickly. We pledged in 1997 to do our utmost to support the treaty and to support autonomy in China and to promote the continuing rule of law. In the last 20 plus years, are you aware of efforts by Canada to do this, or are we dealing with something that we've neglected for 20 years?
I think over the past 20 years, I have witnessed very little effort being done by our Canadian government to sustain the one country, two system, and also all the core values that have been such as the rule of law, freedoms, human rights, and even democracy being promised to the Hong Kong people. And all the time, the Chinese government has been breaking its promises. Say, for instance, the election with universal suffrage has been forever postponed, and now there's absolutely no hope because even the Legislative Council that is scheduled to be conducted this fall has been postponed for 1 year. So I think it's really a shame that because of the false, the lack of response and also the lack of exemplifying responsibility to hold China accountable for what it promises in its international treaty, that has led to the present situation in Hong Kong. And I'm quite sure this would not be confined to Hong Kong, because when China can break the promises towards Hong Kong, it can also do the same to any other country, including Canada. So I think it's about time for the world to revisit our strategy towards China. And we should all work together, particularly among the Five Eyes allies, to come up with a strong foreign policy towards China, and also hold China accountable for all the, behavior that is not rule-based, that does not conform to the international,
standards.
Rules
Yes.
and yes, standards.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree with you more, and I also agree very much that there's a real sense of urgency. In particular, the useful phrase you talked about, safe harbor measures that Canada should try to undertake very, very quickly. We also need to act quickly, I think, in dealing with the foreign interference that you've described, and I think Sherry Wong has described. And perhaps if I can ask Sherry, are you aware, or either of you, are you aware of any countermeasures or counteractions being taken in a coordinated way by the National Police Force, the RCMP, or CSIS in dealing with this kind of interference on Canadian soil, which appears to be widespread? Is there anything going on that you're aware of, or is that something that we ought to look into more closely?
I think it's something we have to look into more closely. Like you said, our CMP and CSIS are bodies that's supposed to exist to protect us from these threats and these interference, but I don't believe they have all the tools and the proper understanding on how the CCP is operating. It's not necessarily a check in exchange for service, but it is more malicious and sophisticated. Like many of the witnesses have said, we need an attitude change when dealing with China, and especially in how they interfere with Canadian affairs. It's definitely more complex, and it's across multiple sectors. It's not only the physical threats, it's also infiltration in media, in academia, in social media, spreading misinformation campaigns. So it's a lot. There's a lot of sophistication behind their techniques, and I'm not sure Canada is ready to deal with this level of sophisticated interference campaign yet.
You mentioned 3 universities, McGill University, the University of Toronto, and I believe it was Waterloo.
Yes.
Am I right? Yes. Why in particular did you mention them, and what efforts ought the government be making to deal with those issues?
Very briefly, we have 15 seconds.
Absolutely. There's actually been a report, very detailed, done on PLA's cooperation with universities. And I mentioned these specific 3 because they're the top 10 in the world in receiving collaborative projects with the PLA. It's been, sorry, I'm out of time.
I'm sorry also, but that is how the committee rules work. So Mr. Harris, thank you very much. Your time is concluded. And now for the second round, 5 minutes each, we'll start with Mr. Chu. Welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the witness coming to the committee and talk to us about how relevant the Hong Kong situation is into Canada. But allow me to just play devil's advocate here a little bit, because in the community, China has been telling through its mouthpiece that what happened in Hong Kong, it's purely domestic issues, and it's nothing to do with Canada. So, and this is a Canada-China Relations Special Committee, and it's not a Canada-Hong Kong Relations Special Committee. And so, therefore, as a devil's advocate, Can you tell me why is Canada-Hong Kong a critical part of Canada-China's relation here? Why is the relevance of what's happening in Hong Kong, and why should we as Canadian care? I'd like to ask the witnesses, the Canadian-based witnesses, ACHK, and then the Hong Kong link, please. Ms. Wong, go ahead. Sorry, Chair.
That's quite all right. Thank you. I think Ms. Wong is frozen for a moment. Should we go to Mr. Wong, Mr. Chu? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Mr. Wong.
Thank you. I think
can get started.
Yeah. Sure. Maybe I'll do a brief some brief lines on responding to Mr. Chu, and then I'll move on to my colleague Sherry to give more details. So I think, first of all, the committee would like to pay attention to how 300K Canadians are living and residing and working in Hong Kong right now, which is already a very substantial link currently to between Canada and Hong Kong. And another important link that I think most Canadians and even most Canadians will have neglected is a historical link where Canadians actually helped Hong Kong in the Second World War in defending Hong Kong land. And Hong Kongers have been thanking Canadians every year. So I think I would like to draw a committee to this particular two level of links, and I will pass directed to my colleague Sherry to elaborate more.
Thanks. Thank you for the question. And absolutely, there's going to be questions on why Hong Kong is related to Canada. And I think us as our core values, then when we talk about China, we cannot look away from Hong Kong. And it's not only Hong Kong, it is also Mongolia, it is also Tibet, it is also East Turkestan, and the human rights atrocities. And there's a crisis happening in these territories. Each of them are a little different from others, but the common link is it is the Chinese Communist Party who is orchestrating the humanitarian crisis. So as this committee examine how Canada must move on with our relationship with China, I think human rights definitely is on the top of our mind. And secondarily, trade is something that is on a lot of your minds as you talk about China. And it is important to remember we are complicit in exporting dual-use technology that are being used for human rights violation. We are buying products of slave labor from Uyghur camps and from Uyghur prisoners. So as this committee move on to study the greater relationship between China and Hong Kong and Canada, you have to consider how China has completely disrespected international law and order. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is an international agreement, and they have just tossed that aside, not only in 2019, but also in 2003, 2014. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Fong.
Yes. I think there are a few reasons why Hong Kong really matters to all Canadians. Number one, Hong Kong is the largest Canadian city outside of Canada, with its not only 300,000 Canadians living there. If we count those people who went back to Hong Kong without claiming non-resident status, actually the total number exceeds 500,000 based on my conversation with the Canadian consulate representative in Hong Kong. And number two, Hong Kong people and Canadians share common values. And what the Hong Kong people are struggling to preserve in Hong Kong, such as rule of law, freedom, human rights, and democracy, are values that Canadians as well as global villages all treasure. Therefore, Hong Kong people are actually at the forefront fighting against the Chinese authoritarian regime, which is a major threat to the global democracy. So
thank you, Ms. Fong. Sorry to interrupt you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chu, and Mr. Oliphant, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. It's nice to see you again, Ms. Wong and Mr. Wong, and nice to meet you, Ms. Fung. And somewhere else. I'm looking at my screen quickly, Mrs. Calverley. I've got two basic questions I want to ask. And the first one, nothing you have said today was news to me. I've been following the issue closely since I was in Hong Kong over a year ago when the extradition debate was ongoing. I visited the LegCo and heard that. I met with a number of activists. And so when the security legislation came in, I was not totally shocked, but I was surprised at the rapidity of it. What I'd like to hear from each of you first is, what do you think changed vis-a-vis China's understanding of Hong Kong and its tightening? It started before the extradition changes, but then continued rapidly, and then with the demonstrations, we got the national security, the legislation. What has happened in China that has taken a 50-year horizon on Hong Kong and shortened it to the diminishment of the Hong Kong that we know today? Just help me understand that. Maybe we begin with Ms. Wong, and then Ms. Fung, Mr. Wong, and Ms. Calverley.
Thank you. I think it's important to understand that the deterioration of Hong Kong's one country two system has started the moment Hong Kong was handed over to China. It wasn't something new, but it was something slow. And through time, in 2014, we saw the violent crackdown on the Umbrella Revolution. We saw the tightening of political freedoms. And since 2014, that has accelerated. And in 2019, when the extradition movement broke out, I think the central government and the Hong Kong government realized that the Hong Kong people is committed in a democratic Hong Kong. And that is a very dangerous idea because Hong Kong is the window to China for many years. And with this massive grassroots democratic movement, it is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's rule as a whole. So the violent and swift crackdown of Hong Kong is not shocking, but in fact expected. That is how they can assert control. And with this new national security law, there is extradition written into it. So the extradition treaty, while that was scrapped at the beginning of the movement, it's kind of made a full turn, and we are going to extradite people.
Thank you. I'm just going to push on.
Sorry, there's also
push
the
on a little quickly because I want everyone
affairs.
to get in. I only have 5 minutes, so just brief comments from the others. Then I have a second question I'd like to ask.
Yeah. Okay.
Ms. Fung?
Okay. I think a lot of people have misunderstanding about the situation in China. I worked in China for 5 years between 1984 to 1989, managing World Bank and also European soft loan projects there. Actually, if we understand China thoroughly, there are also quite a lot of risks that they are facing, such as the dropping of the GDP and also the unrest in different parts of China. Therefore, over the last couple of years, the courageous resistance movement in Hong Kong actually pose a threat to the sustainability and stability of the communist rule. They don't want the resistance movement to have a rippling effect in the rest of China. So this is number one. Yeah.
Any other comments?
Can I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, because for China, this is a plan, a master plan to incorporate Hong Kong into Greater Bay Area. So you may have heard of Red Capital, because actually a lot of businesses, also financial company, now actually under the Chinese capital. And China heavily relying on Hong Kong. So that's why Hong Kong matters, because over 73% of IPO raising money, especially US dollar, they need Hong Kong. I think the Communist Party, they thought that they can have full control of Hong Kong and use Hong Kong as the financial center for China to raise money. But then they forgot there is a Hong Kong Policy Act. That is US.
I just want to get to my other question.
I'm sorry, Mr. Elephant. Afraid we're at the end of your time.
All right.
And we'll go on to Ms. Alislev for 5 minutes. Ms. Alislev? Oh, please
there we
unmute.
go.
Okay.
Thank you very much. This is a very important conversation, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for the courage that they've shown in coming forward to help us to understand that this is not only, as I understand what you've said, a Hong Kong and China problem, it is actually a Canadian sovereignty and security problem, and we don't have the luxury of time. And so we must act with a sense of urgency if I'm appreciating and understanding what you're saying accurately. So if I could, in order to be able to provide recommendations to government, we need specifics. So Ms. Fung and Ms. Wong have both identified the incredible importance to having legislation to combat foreign influence, not only around diplomats and other things, but around academia, journalists, etc. I'm wondering, Ms. Wong, could you give us some more information on the top universities that you highlighted, McGill, Waterloo, and University of Toronto, their relationship with the People's Liberation Army, and why that should matter, and what legislatively, and I'd like to ask Ms. Fung as well, what legislatively specifics can we do to protect Canadian sovereignty and security, and of course, Chinese citizens in Canada and human rights and democracy around the world? Ms. Wong?
Okay,
I think Ms. Wong. Go
I'll
ahead,
try.
please.
So the PLA. Oh, sorry. It's a little unstable. It says, "Oh, am I back?" Cool. It's been many years since PLA sending Chinese scholars to different universities to study, and there's been a systematic setup in these research agreements to export the results back to China. And I think I'll get to the policy recommendations specifically. I think we need to have a more strict application process for grants happening in Canada. We need to examine whether these grants and these projects are the intellectual property being exported to foreign countries, not limited to China, but other countries as well. And we also need a cohesive federal policy that examines how dual-use technology are being used for commercial reasons and how they are being used in foreign lands. And I think one of the more urgent things that we can do is to refine and update the global affairs export lists. Currently, there is a list of dual-use technology on that export list, but it's not comprehensive enough. And technology moves very quickly in the 21st century.
And thank you very much, because I don't want to run out of time. So if I could ask Ms. Fung.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Canadians in general, including our government, exemplify lack of understanding and also knowledge about how China's sharp power operates. Infiltration, manipulation, and also control over the direction of all our research institutes, as well as university research projects, is tremendous. Over the past few years, I've witnessed anonymous donation being given to different universities in order to control, or to control the direction of its development research. And quite often, once the product has been, the intellectual products is usually being shipped out of Canada without sufficient scrutiny. And say, for instance, this surveillance program in China, the core technology actually stems from Canadian university.
And thank you. If I could just ask, there's much more that you want to say. So please, could I ask you to send us in a document additional specifics, because this is such an important aspect that we aren't collectively aware of, that it would really help this committee in our recommendations if you could do that.
Actually, I suggest that there should be another round of hearing.
I believe our team has already sent in an issue brief.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fung, and thank you, Ms. Alice Lev. We'll now go to Mr. Frederick for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question about issues relating to what Mr. Wong brought up. Mr. Wong, thank you very much for being a voice for youth. My question relates to social media. Social media has provided a space in many instances, not just with respect to Hong Kong, but since we are focusing on Hong Kong, it is a space for democratic activism. To what extent is it fair to say that the national security law completely upends the opportunity for activists, in particular youth activists, to engage in issues around democracy, Mr. Wong?
Thank you. And I think it would be best for me to answer with particulars where, as this committee may have been aware, that Telegram, a instant messaging application, has been one of the major channel of communication within Hong Kong young people, especially. And the police force has a few months ago actually confiscated a few channels on Telegram. So I would say, even without the national security law, social media is not a safe space for young protesters in Hong Kong. And what I think what we should concern about is how this overreaching jurisdiction provided by national security law may have further threatened this kind of communication in Hong Kong and out of Hong Kong as well.
Thank you very much for that. You know, there's much more that can be said and much more that that can be done. I'm glad, though, that the Canadian government has taken steps to issue strong statements, but beyond strong statements, through actions, suspending the extradition treaty with Hong Kong, for example, the export of sensitive goods. These are things, concrete actions that the Canadian government has undertaken. But as I said, we can always look to see what else can be done. And these hearings are important opportunities for activists and others to tell us their views and their thoughts on possible paths forward. In the time remaining, I did want to ask, and this is open to whoever wishes to take the question. It is general. We have seen reports emerge for some time now about the human rights abuses that have been perpetrated towards the Uyghur minority. To what extent is there fear among Hong Kong focused activists here in Canada, but also within Hong Kong itself, that what is transpiring vis-a-vis the Chinese state and the Uyghur minority could unfold in some shape or form in Hong Kong as a way to further suppress democracy in the territory?
I see Ms. Fong indicating a desire to respond to that. Please go ahead and unmute. Ms. Fong, Ms. Wong. I'm sorry. I meant Ms. Wong. Excuse me. I'm sorry. She did have her finger up earlier. Ms. Wong. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think it's been on every Hong Konger's mind to another East Turkestan. Fear anymore. It is with evidence that we are seeing Hong Kong slowly adopting the same policies that were used in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, and Tibet. Whether it was the collection of DNA information from those who were arrested, the surveillance state, as you mentioned, social media is no longer a safe space because it's being surveyed, and many have been arrested for their content on social media. So we're seeing the same kind of suppression, and the arrest of Jimmy Lai and the media executives is also an indication on how Hong Kong is being shifted, and it's been something that is on top of Hong Kongers' mind for many months.
Ms. Fung, 35 seconds. Is that all right, Mr. Frederick? Got it.
Now,
yes,
it's quite all right, Mr. Chair. That's great.
We have a very famous saying: today, East Turkestan; tomorrow, Hong Kong. Unfortunately, now we have to change it to today East Turkestan, today Hong Kong as well. Over the past 1 year, we have seen Hong Kong being turned into a police state with surveillance camera everywhere in major streets. And at the same time, police in Hong Kong have been using excessive force to crack down on civil society. And there has been massive arrests, and a lot of people have been arrested, but there are also quite a lot of people who have disappeared, and they have
Thank you,
been made
Ms.
to
Fong. I'm
commit.
sorry, we're over Mr. Prajus time, and I hate to cut anybody off, but the committee has set these rules about how much time each member has. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron, pendant.
And now, Mr. Bergeron, for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to go on with the line of questioning I started a few minutes ago, and playing devil's advocate. This time, I would ask my question of Madame Caverly, since she didn't have an opportunity to answer my first question. So, playing devil's advocate, I think the international community is willing to welcome the greatest number of activists from Hong Kong for them to get away from repression. But from the point of view of Hong Kongers, isn't this going to weaken the pro-democracy movement on Hong Kong's territory?
Actually, we are in close contact with many activists. So actually, a lot of protesters, they have decided to stay even if there will be offer like an airlift by other governments. So, but of course, a lot of protesters, they want to seek refuge. So I think international governments need to get ready. And for example, for the UK, they already offered the BNO, British National Overseas, to come to the UK. So that there's around 2.9 million people eligible. But then majority young people, they are not British National Overseas. So that's why we hope Canada can take care of young people, that they don't have this privilege to go to the UK. And it is a very urgent situation. So I think Canada needs to have a policy right away to help those who want to escape. Yeah, thank you.
Je crois que M. Wong veut ajouter quelque chose.
I think Mr. Wong wants to add something, Mr. Chair.
And I'd just like to add something on. First of all, like as a former student leader, I can tell you that a lot of protesters in Hong Kong, they are not like, even though as a student leader and student activist, I can tell you a lot of protesters, they're from different age, of different gender, from all walks of life. And so I think if Canada has the capacity, we should not, like, we should help young people, of course, but like we should not only focus on young people, because a lot of protesters who love Hong Kong, they're actually like from all different age, gender, ethnicity.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Harris for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I too have a question or two questions rather, for Ms. Calverley. First of all, Britain is the only, other than China, signatory to the treaty referring to the 1997 changeover. What special right does the UK have to enforce that treaty that Canada doesn't have or other countries don't have? And why is it not taking a stronger lead in dealing with this? I know there's the British overseas passports, which is a special circumstance. And the second question has to do with other nations. I know 27 countries joined in a statement to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Does your organization, the Hong Kong Watch, have organizations in many of these other countries as well? Or are you focused on the UK and in this case, Canada?
We are international, so we involve in the US, Canada, the European Union, and of course the UK. And we are the secretary of the European all-party parliamentary groups. And so I want to answer your question on the UN. Actually, our colleague will testify on Thursday. Will tell you more about the United Nations. We initiate that with Lord Chris Patton, our patrons. So we really hope there will be a UN special envoy or rapporteur to be in Hong Kong to monitor the situation. I think that's very important. We need to have Canada and many other like-minded countries to join force to get that, to have that happen. So that is the United Nations.
Can you answer about the role of the UK as the only signatory to this treaty? Do they have any special rights to enforce this that Canada does not have, and are they prepared to use them?
So I think under the British Joint Declaration, so there was no remedy. So when they talk about when there's a breach of the Joint Declaration. So I think right now, the remedy right now is to offer British national overseas the chance to move to the UK. So we're talking about 2.9 million Hong Kongers who will be eligible to move to the UK. And I think for other action the UK will do will be the sanction action. So that will be the UK will do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. That concludes our first panel today, and I want to echo the comments. I don't think there was any of my colleagues who spoke who didn't thank all the witnesses and admire your appearance today. We very much appreciate you coming before us today, and we'll now have to suspend for 5 minutes while we get set for the next panel. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
welcome back. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. Having said that, during the question and answer period, I think you'll find that the members who ask you a question will indicate who they'd like to have answer, and then you can go ahead without waiting for me at that time until we get to the end of their time. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. As you are speaking, if you plan to alternate from one language to the other, you will also need to switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you are speaking. You may want to allow for a short pause while switching languages. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute, please. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. So it's now my pleasure to welcome our second panel of witnesses. From Amnesty International Canada, we have Alex Neve, Secretary General. From the National Endowment for Democracy, we have Akram Karam, Program Officer for China. From Human Rights Watch, we have Sophie Richardson, China Director, Human Rights Watch. Each witness will have 7 to 10 minutes, let's say up to 10 minutes, to make an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from the members, 2 rounds, I hope, at least. So we'll begin with Mr. Neve. You have 10 minutes, sir. Please unmute.
There, thanks. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's certainly a pleasure to be with the special committee this afternoon, this morning for any of you who are out west, and to join with my 2 wonderful colleagues. There have obviously been many troubling chapters along the road which has brought Hong Kongers to the terrifying reality they face today, which is a rapidly deteriorating human rights crisis that needs decisive and concerted international action. The umbrella movement 6 years ago, the courageous protests responding to extradition reform last year, and now the national security law, which Amnesty International has described as follows: Beijing's most breathtaking, threatening, and callous attack yet, the greatest threat to human rights in the city's recent history. The aim of Chinese authorities is to govern Hong Kong through fear from this point forward. These are, of course, not abstract predictions, given the backdrop of China's long-standing and frankly atrocious human rights record, very much in the spotlight currently with the massive harrowing campaign against Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, arrests and unfair trials of human rights lawyers and advocates, ongoing abuses against Tibetans, the crackdown against Falun Gong now into its 21st year, and closer to home, 8 Canadian prisoners in China of concern to Amnesty International, including 4 Canadians who have been sentenced to death, 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, arbitrarily unlawfully arrested and detained, and 2 other Canadians, Hussein Chilil and Sun Jian, serving lengthy prison terms after deeply unfair trials. With all of that in mind, we have pointed to 10 chilling reasons to be concerned about Hong Kong's national security law. 1, endangering national security can and does mean virtually anything: secession, subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign forces, incur maximum penalties of life imprisonment, and are so broadly defined that they can easily become catch-all offenses. 2, the law has been abused from day one. People have been arrested for possessing flags, stickers, and banners with political slogans. Police and officials have claimed that slogans, t-shirts, songs, and even holding up pieces of white paper endanger national security. The Hong Kong government has declared that "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times," a common political slogan during last year's protests, connotes Hong Kong independence and is forbidden. 3, the law is all-pervasive, including tightened controls over education, journalism, and social media. 4, people could be taken to mainland China for unfair trials, precisely what was at stake in last year's massive protests against extradition reform. 5, the law applies to everyone on the planet, literally everyone, everywhere. Number 6, Investigating authorities have new and extensive powers, including to search properties, restrict or prohibit travel, freeze or confiscate assets, censor online content, and engage in covert surveillance, including intercepting communications, all without a court order. 7, the Chinese central government is setting up an office for safeguarding national security in the heart of Hong Kong. The office and its staff do not fall under Hong Kong's jurisdiction. Number 8, the Hong Kong government has set up a new body, the Committee for Safeguarding National Security, including an advisor from the Chinese central government. Its decisions are not subject to court review. Number 9, human rights protections risk being overridden. The national security law includes a general guarantee to respect human rights, but grants immunities and vast exemptions to national security institutions and explicitly has precedence over any other laws. And number 10, the law has already had an immediate chilling effect. Hong Kongers have shut down their social media accounts. Shops and restaurants have removed banners and stickers in support of the protest movement. And public libraries have sorted out books on sensitive issues and authors by activists critical of the government. There's little doubt that those grave concerns have indeed proven out. Current Amnesty International press releases on urgent actions make that abundantly clear. 4 activists, 3 male and 1 female, aged 16 to 21, arrested 2 weeks ago under the security law, accused of advocating Hong Kong independence. Disqualification of 12 pro-democracy candidates, including Joshua Wong, from running in Hong Kong's now delayed Legislative Council elections. Among other grounds offered to justify this, that objecting to the recently enacted national security law demonstrates that as lawmakers, they could not genuinely uphold their constitutional duty. And most recently, of course, yesterday's national security arrests of well-known democracy activist Agnes Chow, accused of inciting secession, and prominent publisher Jimmy Lai, 2 of his sons and staff of his newspaper, The Apple Daily, for, quote, colluding with foreign powers. So faced with this mounting crisis, here are 5 quick suggestions as to where Canada should focus its efforts. First, multilateralism is key, and the wider and more diverse the coalition of states prepared to speak out about concerns, the more effective. Canada's done so on a number of occasions over the past year with respect to the crisis in Hong Kong and other concerns in China, including a joint oral statement from 28 governments at the UN Human Rights Council on June 30th, and Minister Champagne joining counterparts from Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States in a statement of concern about Hong Kong 2 days ago. Broadening the group of states prepared to exert public pressure on China should be a strong focus for Canada. Second, staying with multilateralism, Canada should actively pursue action within the UN human rights system. A public statement issued on June 26 by 50 UN independent human rights experts lays out a range of options, for instance, for moves that could be attempted at the UN Human Rights Council, the next session of which gets underway on September 14th. Third, Canada is well placed to lead international readiness for the prospect that many Hong Kongers may be forced to flee as refugees. The geography of Hong Kong is such that unlike many refugee situations around the world, they clearly cannot escape across the most immediate border into China. People needing to flee will be in many different situations, including individuals with citizenship in other countries, such as over 300,000 Canadians residing in Hong Kong, individuals who are not citizens but have close family and other links to Canada or other countries, and those who have no strong connection with any other country. Canada should be working to prepare arrangements to receive potentially a large number of Canadians who may be forced to leave Hong Kong suddenly, and also collaborating with other governments to prepare a well-coordinated response to wider refugee needs. 4, Canada should be looking at options under Canadian law and policy to exert greater pressure directly. In general, human rights concerns with respect to Hong Kong and more widely should be prioritized in all dealings with China, not just between diplomats, but across all bilateral exchanges, including trade and investment. Extradition arrangements with Hong Kong have been suspended and the transfer of sensitive security equipment has been tightened up. The government has been pressed by a sizable group of MPs and senators to consider sanctions under the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. In considering any and all further steps, it's advisable to prioritize measures that can be advanced multilaterally in concert with other governments. And finally, let me bring this very close to home. Amnesty International is part of the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China, made up of 15 organizations here in Canada. On behalf of the coalition, we prepared 2 reports over the past 3 years, documenting a disturbing and intensifying pattern of intimidation, interference, and threats against human rights defenders based here who are involved in campaigning with respect to human rights concerns in China. Individuals responsible for these abuses are linked to, or at least encouraged and lauded by Chinese government officials. Our most recent report, provided to the government in March of this year and released publicly in May, notes that over the past year, individuals supportive of the movement for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong, in particular, have been targeted relentlessly, including at demonstrations and through social media. In 2017 and again this year, the coalition made numerous recommendations to the Canadian government for more effective action to protect human rights defenders in this country from these abuses, focusing on the need for more coordination among police, security, and government agencies and departments. To our considerable disappointment, we have had little response. Individuals experiencing these instances of interference and of threats, including threats of sexual and other physical violence and threats against family members in Hong Kong or in China, are largely left without effective recourse, often unsure where to turn and what to expect. It may be a considerable challenge to counter China's influence on the world stage. It may be difficult to exert pressure for human rights reform on the ground in China. But there is no excuse for a failure to take robust and decisive steps to counter human rights abuses that may be linked to or backed by Beijing, connected to what is happening in Hong Kong, and that take place here in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Neve. Thank you very much. And we'll now go on to Mr. Karam for 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to be offering the testimony before this body today with other distinguished guests, including my friend Sophie. I have been invited to offer remarks on behalf of Mr. Carl Gershman, President of the National Endowment for Democracy, one of 11 individual Americans officially sanctioned by the Chinese government just yesterday for their support of pro-democracy activism in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an international cosmopolitan city, a global financial center that is praised for its culture of diversity and inclusiveness, freedom of expression, and robust rule of law. For the past 17 months, it has captured the attention of the world as millions of ordinary Hong Kongers took to the streets to protest a controversial extradition bill, which over time became a protest movement about the basic rights and freedoms of the Hong Kong people. Sadly, the just and legal demands of Hong Kongers has been met with local officials' indifference, suppression, arrests, and breathtaking police brutality, all directly backed by the central government in Beijing. Since June 2019, Hong Kong police have made around 9,000 arrests related to the protest movement. Among them, over 700 children are under the age of 18, including 8 elementary school students. Despite international outcry and criticism, things have only continued to get worse for the people of Hong Kong. On June 30th, in near complete secrecy and with no regard for internationally recognized legal obligations to the city of Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party forced through the new law of the People's Republic of China on safeguarding national security in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Hereafter, I'm going to refer as NSL. Already, the NSL has brought about one of the darkest moments in Hong Kong's history, attacking Hong Kongers' fundamental rights and freedoms. The NSL has carved out unprecedented space for CCP leadership to deliver and systematically impose its will in Hong Kong, and they have wasted no time in using it to arrest activists in the street, disqualify pro-democracy politicians, dismiss tenured academics, and just yesterday, silenced the voice of critical media outlets. In spite of these heavy-handed and often violent actions, Hong Kong's citizens have not simply or quietly given up their rights. Last November, amid record turnout, pro-democracy candidates won in 17 out of 18 district elections. Since then, Hong Kongers have turned into the international community to take action, activating their international networks, including those here in Canada, to encourage governments around the world to take a stand, whether by canceling extradition agreements with Hong Kong or calling on the United Nations to launch an investigation. Just last month, over 600,000 citizens once again took to the polls to support pro-democracy candidates in the Legislative Council elections primaries. And then, in a shocking display of disregard for the legally guaranteed rights of Hong Kongers and demonstrating the extent of Beijing's fears, the Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced that the Legislative Council elections would be delayed for a full year. It is crucial that the governments around the world recognize the CCP's actions stand in absolute conflict with existing local and international laws and norms. The NSL directly contradicts parts of Hong Kong's Basic Law and the Bill of Rights Ordinance. Further, the provisions of the NSL also conflict with China's obligations under international law, such as the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The NSL also takes the unprecedented step of asserting jurisdiction over citizens of other countries. It is therefore not just the Hong Kong's legal institutions under attack, but also the international legal system that Beijing challenged with its authoritarian overreach. There is much the international community can do in response. First and foremost, it takes steps to protect Hong Kongers who are seeking to resettle themselves and families. Since May, thousands of Hong Kongers have applied for foreign immigration documents seeking safety and protection in third countries, including Canada. This includes a large number of students and young activists who are alarmed at the Hong Kong government's effort to impose so-called patriotic education and other nationalistic initiatives that challenge Hong Kong's academic freedom, cultural and political diversity. After the arrest of Jimmy Lai just days ago, Hong Kongers are also rightly concerned that the CCP will begin rolling out the censorship and surveillance machines it has perfected in East Turkestan, which the CCP refers to as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It is incumbent upon the international community to consider other measures that might be undertaken to protect the future of democracy, freedom, and rule of law in Hong Kong. Without such support, as the events over the last few days have shown, the shadow of authoritarian rule will continue to grow in ways that are all too familiar to those who have already suffered the CCP's coercion and repression like us from the Uyghur community. Here at the National Endowment for Democracy, we believe in the rights of all people to freely determine their government, one that ensures freedom of expression, belief, and association, respects the fundamental rights of individuals and minorities, promotes a free press, and supports meaningful access to justice. We also believe that the actions of the Chinese government speak for themselves, whether in regard to its denial of basic rights and freedoms for its people or its abuse of authority to breach legal commitments in Hong Kong. We urge the Canadian government to stand with other nations to condemn the CCP's abrogation of the rights of Hong Kongers and violations of the integrity of the international legal order. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I failed to unmute. That often happens with folks here, not usually the chair, but I apologize for that. I just was thanking Mr. Karam for his testimony and also, or for his opening statement, and also for holding up the microphone so that we could all hear him while you couldn't hear me. And now we'll go over to Ms. Richardson for up to 10 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I know that you're taking on very important work in studying the Canada-China relationship, and I'm honored to be invited to speak with this committee today. I've overseen all of Human Rights Watch's work on China since joining the organization in 2006. And throughout that period, we've enjoyed a strong collaboration with Canadian officials in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Ottawa. I only wish that there had been progressively less to talk about, but unfortunately the opposite is true. Now we not only grapple with human rights violations of an unprecedented scope and scale inside the mainland, such as those ongoing against Uyghurs and Tibetans, but increasingly also outside the country, including Beijing's efforts to undermine the very international institutions we all rely on to protect human rights around the world, and indeed Chinese government-generated threats to human rights in Canada. We're here today to discuss Beijing's unprecedented assault on 7 million Hong Kong people's human rights. The Chinese authorities' decision to impose so-called national security legislation on Hong Kong violates the basic law, the territory's functional constitution, and violates the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but not ratified, but to which Hong Kong is a party. From 1 minute to the next, on June 30th, Hong Kong people were robbed of their rights to peaceful assembly, expression, and political participation, and of the promise of one country, two systems until at least 2047. The national security law's vague and overbroad provisions are devastating to human rights, not least through the creation of specialized secret security agencies, denying fair trial rights in periodic elections, providing sweeping new powers to the police, increasing restraints on civil society and the media, and weakening judicial oversight. In Human Rights Watch's view, this is a law that has nothing to do with the security. It is a roadmap for repression. The developments of just the past 24 hours, the arrests of Apple Daily owner Jimmy Lai and pro-democracy activists, including Agnes Chow under the NSL, make that reality starkly clear. We thank Canada for its public concerns about the NSL, its efforts to coordinate that view with like-minded governments, and its swift suspension of the extradition treaty with Hong Kong. We also want to thank Canada for its efforts at the Human Rights Council, calling on Chinese authorities to end violations against human rights defenders and ethnic and religious minorities, among other issues. Yet the very existence of the national security law shows that many governments' efforts are unfortunately not enough. It is imperative not just to call out Beijing's violations, it is also critically and urgently important to put an end to the extraordinary sense of impunity Beijing continues to enjoy for state-sponsored human rights violations. To that end, we urge Canada to, first and foremost, publicly and unequivocally state that Canada will not cooperate with or enable the NSL's extraterritorial application or with Hong Kong police requests for information concerning those accused of national security crimes. Canada should also swiftly adopt mechanisms to enable people from Hong Kong to find safe haven in Canada and ensure Hong Kong activists who relocated to Canada can continue their activism safely and without harassment from the Chinese government, including by any overseas United Front initiatives. Canada can urgently augment the capabilities of its consulate in Hong Kong to monitor human rights violations and the impact of the NSL and increase support for human rights groups, independent local media, and internet freedom, can impose targeted sanctions on those Chinese and Hong Kong officials involved in drafting, adopting, and implementing the law, and thereby violating core human rights as laid down in international law. It can ensure internet service providers refuse to cooperate with Hong Kong police force requests for providing, removing, or limiting online expressions of political views. And it can ensure companies limit exporting equipment or technology and technical support that can be used for intercepting personal communication or conducting surveillance to the Hong Kong police force. Canada can also engage chambers of commerce and other industry associations to reaffirm support for the respective human rights, the rule of law, and civic participation, and communicate publicly the social, financial, and operational risks presented by the law. I want to particularly stress two last recommendations. One, as Alex mentioned earlier, support for the late June call by 50 United Nations human rights experts to hold a special session on China at the Human Rights Council and establish a new monitoring mechanism on China. These are the kinds of steps that will help puncture that expectation of impunity on Beijing's part. I would also like to urge the government to think about creating a cabinet level position to coordinate and develop and implement China policy. This is no longer an issue that fits solely and neatly in the traditional bailiwicks of foreign affairs or trade. Increasingly, we see threats to academic freedom. We see threats to the diaspora community. We see concerns across immigration matters. These are not terribly well integrated. This is not a recommendation we would only make to the government of Canada, but I think this is a particular moment at which the creation of such a position would resonate, both in Beijing and in Hong Kong, but also for citizens across Canada. We are aware that Chinese authorities place pressure on other governments and businesses to stay silent about human rights violations, such as those posed by the NSL. But the importance of ensuring respect for the human rights of 7 million Hong Kong people is undeniable. Violations of rights of this scale and severity require steadfastness and perseverance. By actively taking steps to help the Hong Kong people and raise the price on rights violating officials in Beijing and Hong Kong, Canada can help mitigate repression both now and in the future. We urge that you do so in coordination with like-minded governments to create more leverage. We thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richardson, and thanks to all the witnesses for staying within your time for your statements. We'll now begin the first round of questions with Mr. Chu for 6 minutes. Mr. Chu, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses and coming in front of the committee to speak about the issue of Hong Kong and China in relation to Canada. As a newly elected MP, I was invited to go to Hong Kong in a district council election observer mission in November 2019, and we actually produced a report that actually had some positive feedback for the Hong Kong government, and we were pleasant to witness some of the exercising of democracy. In that district election, the people in Hong Kong had judged profoundly and decisively on the side of democracy. And so as somebody who was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Canada, this is actually quite satisfactory for me to see democracy in practice. Now, fast forward to 2020, where we are today, we see that all sectors in Hong Kong under the dark shadow of fear in Hong Kong, including the press through Apple Daily, for example, speech, freedoms of speech were jeopardized. The Foreign Correspondents Club, for example, they were issuing a very critical statement against the NSL and the arrest of Mr. Jimmy Lai. People could be getting arrested for singing certain particular songs or yelling particular slogans. So the freedom of expression is also jeopardized. Their association, the freedom of expression is also being harmed. They willy-nilly disqualify political leaders and even legislators just based on their opinions. So there is definitely a dark shadow of fear overcasting Hong Kong. However, in Canada and also in the rest of the world, I would argue that there is also a opaque white fear that is now casting over Canada. We see that the NSL, the Hong Kong NSL, has also charged and oversees a 25 years U.S. citizens, Samuel Chu, as one of their accused. And I have, in this writing here, I have a constituents who actually presented a petition to advocate the government of Canada to exercise the Magnitsky Act in sanctioning China or Hong Kong, and he would be under the same cloud as well. So my question for the witness here is that how would you suggest Canadian governments do to safeguard Canadians' safety, regardless of their ethnicity? We know that in 2006, for example, as mentioned, the Uyghur Canadian Hussein Salih was actually arrested in Uzbekistan, but extradited to China. We have also two Michaels that are being arbitrarily held. How would you suggest that Canada can do to effectively warn Canadian citizens? I've just checked the travel's warning on Canada travel website, and it's just warning Canadians that we need to exercise a high degree of caution. How do we know that they would not get arrested? How do we know that en route they would not get arbitrarily extradited to China? Ms. Richardson and Mr. Nave and Mr. Karam, please.
Mr. Chu, thanks so much. It's a big question with a lot of different moving parts to it. And if at its core, the question is about how to protect Canadians' rights, that's my understanding of your question. Obviously, we've made some suggestions about how to deal with the NSL and issues related to extradition and extraterritoriality. But I want to underscore quickly that we're equally concerned about, for example, the confidence that people who have emigrated to Canada from the mainland or from Hong Kong have, that their ability to articulate their views, if those are critical of Chinese state actors, will not result in reprisals to them or to family members in China. Now, I realize there's not necessarily much you can do about the family members in China, but I think reassuring people that the Canadian government encourages that kind of civic activism and will speak up to protect it is critical. And I think that's a political question. It's also about law enforcement. A second area I would look at that we've written about is Chinese government threats to academic freedom. I think Canadian universities are not doing enough to ensure that all people on their campuses, whether they're Canadians of whatever descent, whether they've come from the mainland, whether they've come from Hong Kong or Taiwan, all have equal access to academic freedom on their campuses. I think there have been examples in the last few years when schools have not stood up to defend that space when it's been threatened.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson. Mr. Zanine, unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chu, for the question. Very important. And I think that there seem to be kind of two elements to it. One is the risks, mounting risks Canadians are facing here in Canada. And I guess I would reiterate the comments I made about the report that on behalf of the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China, we have submitted to the government, which I believe you're familiar with and can certainly provide you a copy again, because there's a number of very concrete, not just broadly aspirational, very concrete recommendations for creating hotlines, for more coherence across government agencies to respond to what is a deeply troubling and mounting threat. And really, we've seen very little movement at all for many years as that's gotten worse.
Mr. Neve, I'm sorry to interrupt. But we're over Mr. Chu's time. So thank you. I'm hopefully
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chu, your time has expired.
I understand. If I may, with your indulgence, ask the witness, Mr. Nave, to provide the report to the committee.
Thank you very much. We'll now go on to Mr. Frederick for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for their testimony. Ms. Richardson, in the previous testimony that we heard at committee today, I asked the question of whether or not what is transpiring vis-a-vis the Chinese state and the Uyghur minority, whether or not there's a prospect of that happening in Hong Kong. The witnesses talked about what's happening today as certainly holding the possibility for the future in terms of what Hong Kongers could face. Is it a matter of the Uyghurs today and Hong Kong tomorrow, as they put it?
It's a challenging question, and I think if at their core we're talking about people losing their political rights, people having no access to a fair trial, being denied opportunities to political participation, to having their very identity as a distinct community with a separate language and traditions, I do think those are valid concerns. I think the motivations behind Beijing's policies in the two regions are somewhat different and have played out a bit differently. There, for example, in Xinjiang, obviously, one of the issues that motivates the Chinese government is a desire to radically reimagine or limit or eradicate Islam. There isn't sort of a comparable factor in Hong Kong. There's also the fact that we can still see what's happening in Hong Kong in a way that we can't in Xinjiang. There are still journalists there. There are still qualified barristers and lawyers and some space for civic activism, but it's diminishing quickly. But I wouldn't wait for the one to become the other to try to prevent these outcomes. I think Beijing has offered, even just in the last 2 or 3 years, ample evidence of its profound disdain to gut human rights, even in a place that is as internationally connected, as visible, and as bound by international law as Hong Kong is?
Thank you very much. Mr. Neve, it's nice to see you again, first of all. I have a question about something that we continue to hear. It came up again today. Magnitsky sanctions. If the government of Canada was to move ahead in that direction, I wonder about the consequences for Canadians in China, namely the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. If Canada was to take dramatic action along those lines, what is the prospect for those two individuals? What will happen to the two Michaels? And I'm not asking you, it's obviously impossible to predict, but is it reasonable to suggest and assume that it would dramatically diminish the prospect of the release of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor?
Nice to see you again as well, and that's a very important question, clearly, and I think it is not at all outlandish to be concerned about that, because I think at every turn, be it with respect to what's happening with Meng Wanzhou and her extradition situation, or these broader considerations around how governments are responding, for instance, to the Uyghur crisis or the situation in Hong Kong. If there's one word that very often characterizes China's response, it is retaliation. And therefore, I think the scenario that you're raising is one that would have to be strategically considered very carefully by Canada. Amnesty hasn't said do or don't impose sanctions under the Magnitsky Act. We certainly think it's a strategy worth exploring. We think there are a number of considerations that need to be taken into account, including what you've highlighted, but also the fact that in our view, to go down that road is inevitably going to be much more successful if it can be done on a multilateral basis, that it isn't just Canada. Obviously, the United States has done so as well, but that it's not just Canada as one of a very small handful of states pursuing this, but it's part of a bigger concerted international response, which I think is the imperative that needs to drive Canada's diplomacy across a whole range of strategies, not just the possibility of sanctions.
Thank you very much. With my last question, and it's directed to both Mr. Neve and Ms. Richardson. Mr. Neve, you talked about your deep concern about Chinese government actions and abuses on Canadian territory. Could you give specific examples about what worries you the most? And I suppose the same question goes to Ms. Richardson, phrased exactly like that.
I think very quickly what worries me the most is that Amnesty has been following this through the coalition for many years now. It's getting worse, not better, so that's my first worry. Secondly, as I speak with amazing colleagues with other grassroots human rights organizations here in Canada, it's very clear to me that there is a predominance of threats and intimidation against very courageous women human rights defenders, and it's accompanied by increasing threats of sexual violence, etc. That needs to be a very grave concern. And number three, it's the fact that even though this issue has been in front of the government for quite a number of years now, we really have not seen even some of the simplest steps to try to do something about this taken, even to just improve coordination amongst departments and agencies. And frankly, I think that's unconscionable.
Thank you, Mr. Neve and Mr. Vrajskatis. I'm sorry you're out of time. We'll go just a second, please. Et maintenant, Monsieur.
Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes, please. Mr. Bergeron. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for their significant contributions to our work. We had the opportunity with the previous panel to study the fate or to discuss the fate of the activists in Hong Kong. And this time we're talking, amongst other things, about the influence, or at least the threat put forward by Chinese authorities on nationals here in Canada. So I think that in any case, we have questions we have to ask ourselves. I had the opportunity to discuss with the Chinese ambassador and the Consul General in Montreal. And if I may share with you, the argument that they put forward is to say that given that there was an explosive situation on the ground, the national security law, on the contrary, was intended to maintain stability in Hong Kong in order to ensure that the democratic institutions can function properly there. So in light of what we have been able to see so far and the fears that have been exposed, how much faith can we have in such a claim on the part of the Chinese authorities? And I think it's legitimate to think that stability should be a guarantee of these viability of these rather democratic institutions. But how can we believe in that now, particularly in light of the arrest and detaining of journalists? And as I pointed out to the Chinese diplomats, when there's nothing really set out clearly in the act of what might be something that is a threat to national security, anything can be. So I'd like to have an answer to that question, please.
My colleagues would as well. Clearly, China is not the first government in the world to wrap arguments around stability and security and safety of society around what is in fact a blatant power grab campaign of repression and intimidation masked with rhetoric of national security. And I think that's exactly what we have on the ground in Hong Kong. There is nothing about what we are documenting in terms of how this law is being used that would even remotely back up that claim. Everything about what we've been seeing, especially in these, whatever it is, 5 to 6 weeks since the law came into effect, is all about a human rights crackdown, blatantly and unapologetically so.
I would like to add some comments, if I may. So thank you for your question, Mr. Benjon. So in terms of how much do we have faith in, since they are implementing the national security law just for stability or social security, actually the East Turkestan, what they have done in East Turkestan after the uprising and clash back in July 5th, 2009 is a concrete example. They have been using the national security, domestic stability as an excuse to suppress people and oppress people. And that is exactly what's going to, I'm afraid, is going to happen in Hong Kong. And even the China mainland's national security law, which was passed in 2015, it states very clearly that in the beginning, even before starting the Article 1, it says this is to absolutely protect the leadership of the CCP. So these laws, whether it's national security law or national intelligence law, or in the case of Hong Kong, those national security laws, actually the primary basis and ultimate goal too, to protect the CCP's leadership. And with those laws, there is no guarantee for freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of movement, and a democracy. And actually, what Mr. Chu described previously in his speech of what he saw the democracy side during his visit to November elections in 2009, that is exactly what they fear, what the CCP is feared of. Those democracies are so scared of. They're scary to the CCP, and I'm afraid that going forward, if we do not take actions, and Hong Kong is going to turn to be the next East Turkestan. Thank you.
I'll just add very quickly that obviously states under international law have an obligation to provide public security, but laws like national security legislation are meant to be necessary, narrow, and proportionate. And the national security law and other Chinese government policies are none of those things. Those laws also cannot undercut key human rights commitments or target an entire population. The Chinese government has plenty of existing laws to prosecute credible threats to national security should it need to do that. Many of those laws are deeply problematic. But policies such as the Strike Hard campaign in Xinjiang or the national security law in Hong Kong go wildly beyond what is necessary, narrow, proportionate, or reasonable.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richardson. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. And now, Mr. Harris for 6 minutes.
Much, Chair, and I want to thank the three presenters on very comprehensive presentations and for your presence here today. First of all, to Mr. Neve, and nice to see you again, and thank you for joining us. I appreciated your 10 reasons why this law is absolutely wrong, including the fact that it was abused from the very beginning, from day one, because that is exactly what we're dealing with. But we do have a situation, and perhaps I can ask you this first. Well, first of all, actually, we did make a pledge at the request of both China and the UK back in 1997 to do our utmost to promote the continuing rule of law in Hong Kong and the autonomy of its institutions, and a number of other countries did the same. I don't know, and I've asked other witnesses this, is there any evidence that Canada has done very much in the past 20 plus years to actually try to secure these things during the last period of time? That's number one. But one thing that's in that declaration, and which covers something we're talking about here today, obviously rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was in fact agreed to be applied to Hong Kong, guaranteeing the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, rights to due process, and a fair trial. Very few of which apply in the national security law that's now been imposed. But I want to ask you, is that what leverage is there for the fact that this is said to apply to Hong Kong? As was pointed out just a few minutes ago, China has signed this covenant, but not ratified it, but China is bound by it in respect to Hong Kong. Is that something that can be used, or is that the subject of the UN effort you're talking about?
Well, thank you for both questions, Mr. Harris. With respect to sort of an overview of Canada's history of standing up for rights and democracy over these 20 plus years, I probably don't have time, and actually would frankly admit I probably don't have full knowledge to give you a thorough answer to that question. I guess I would focus on the last year and a half where there have been a number of occasions where Canada's voice has been one of the few to be heard on the world stage, generally with 1, 2, or sometimes as many as 20 to 25 other states in partnership, raising some of these concerns, not in strident or strong language, and perhaps not as strongly as Amnesty International would write, but Canada's been a leader, I think, along with a few others, at a time when very few states are even prepared to whisper a note of concern. I think we've all made recommendations around how that needs to continue, how it needs to become even more multilateral, how maybe we now need to see some more substantial content in terms of what Canada is raising. With respect to your question about the International Covenant, I do think it's a very important piece of the strategy here, and particularly is something Canada should be very much relying upon. And I think it is what opens up, and Sophie was highlighting this as well, the various kinds of UN-focused strategies that really need to be taken much more seriously. So far, we've managed to get some joint statements, either orally at the Human Rights Council or kind of released in writing on the margins of the Human Rights Council, but there's not yet been an initiative, a resolution, a special session within the Council itself. China's always been out of bounds, too much power, too much influence, and that has to give. And using the fact that one of the most important UN human rights treaties governs here is the obvious opening for doing so.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You did mention there was some talk of the Magnitsky sanctions, and relatively few countries have such laws in place. That the UK only very recently passed. Is that something in the context you mentioned the need for coordinated effort, and the largest group that joined together. It was about 27 or 28 countries just recently on June 30th. Are you confident that there could be a larger coalition developed and to support coordinated effort to try and actually change the approach of China towards Hong Kong, or are we dealing with trying to solve the problem of people who need refuge or need safe harbor and need to be dealt with?
Well, I would draw a distinction between the statement I referred to at the end of June wasn't about the Magnitsky Act or sanctions per se. I think, yes, there probably is more space to build the list of countries who gather around those kinds of statements, as opposed to taking more controversial steps like imposing sanctions. That should be a real focus. Canada is a key multilateral player. We have connections across so many different fora. We really should be doing everything we can to get that number from 28 to 35 to 43 to 58 and climbing. So I do think that that's a very important way forward for Canada.
Would the other two panelists care to, Ms. Richardson, perhaps you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I on many levels, I can't improve on what Alex has just offered up, but I think there is a real moment of momentum here that Canada could really seize on, and that many other governments would come along. If you look at, for example, the constituency of governments who've been outraged rightly about abuses of Uyghurs, if you look at some of the governments that are very concerned about not being able to get good information about the origins of COVID, and now if you look at the constituency of governments who are very concerned about Hong Kong,
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Richardson, I'm sorry to interrupt. I apologize, but we're over Mr. Harris's time. We're now on to the second round. Mr. Albus, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and also thank my colleagues for being part of this committee. I do believe this committee has an important role to play, particularly on this issue, so I'm glad we've really restarted specifically in time to deliberate on Hong Kong. Now, I try not to Mr. Chair, when I communicate, I try not to pick on the person, but the policy. In this case, it's the underlying assumption that MP Fragiskatos had mentioned earlier. Now, look, China, the government of China has two of our citizens. I think it's very clear it's hostage diplomacy. But if, we cannot allow ourselves as Canadians or to allow our government to say we will not pursue what is right under human rights. We will not do what is our heritage of standing up against bullies and tyranny when we're called upon. And I'm just surprised that the response that Mr. Fragiskatos got from the gentleman from Amnesty International was almost a shrug of the shoulders. Well, I guess that could happen. Do you not believe that the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, do you not believe that the 300,000 people, Canadians in Hong Kong—
Mr. Albus, order. I have a point of order from Mr. Fragiskatos, and I'm hoping it's not a point of debate. So, Mr. Fragiskatos?
Certainly not a point of debate, Mr. Chair. I just want to put on the record that Mr. Albus is twisting things around and mischaracterizing what I said.
This is not a point of order. This is a point of debate, and it's Mr. Albus who has the floor. Mr. Albus, please.
As I was saying, Mr. Chair, I don't want to make this personal, but I do think we're at a very important point as a country in our dealing with the government of China. So I just would ask, do we not owe, sir, care to those 300,000 individuals, Canadians that are living in Hong Kong? Do we not also owe it to the people that have fought for human rights, democracy, and believe that we can get along when we work with others? Do you believe that if we allow ourselves to be paralyzed with the thinking that we can't do anything in regards to sanctioning China or even whispering anything negative about the Chinese government, that may cause harm to those that have already been harmed and taken hostage by this government? I'd like your response, please.
Well, I'm sorry that you seem to have interpreted my remarks as a shrug of a lack of concern, because that could not be further from the truth. Amnesty works relentlessly to respond to human rights violations in China in Hong Kong, and we've been very actively engaged around the cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, including regular exchanges with their families, discussing strategic possibilities. So I guess I would want to correct whatever reason you have to believe that we're not concerned about the situation on the ground. I think what I was trying to flag is that obviously when deciding on what the most effective and constructive response and strategy going forward, it's vital that Canada be considering a range of consequences and implications, including, yes, is there a possibility that if we do X, that may increase the risk for Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. I didn't say that means don't do it, but that obviously is something that the government should be considering. Also, we should be assessing, is it useful or effective for us to go it alone to do a particular measure? Or should we really invest our energy into getting some other partners so that it can be advanced in concert?
Okay, I do appreciate, sir, you raising that. I do believe your organization has done good work. It's just I think we need to challenge this underlying assumption that if we do anything or speak out, that we will be harmed as a country or as Canadians. That is always the threat. But I think it's a greater threat if we allow people to bully our country and our citizens, whether it be abroad or at home. Now, speaking to that earlier, you'd mentioned that there are some things domestically, sir, that our own security agencies, I believe, are quite attuned to the threats that we're seeing to our citizens. You said that there were some basic things that this government or previous governments have not put in place to check foreign interference. Could you elaborate on that?
And I'll certainly share the report with the committee so you can see this in greater detail. But one of the things we've highlighted is that when individuals do experience these kinds of threats, and as I said, it's often threats of violence, sexual violence, threats to the safety of family members abroad, it's very unclear where they turn to. They go to the RCMP, they're told it's a municipal police matter, they go to a municipal police force, they're told they should go to CSIS, they go to CSIS, and they're told, well, that's really for diplomats, report it to Foreign Affairs. It goes nowhere, and it doesn't even get gathered up in one coherent place so that the government and agencies involved can really develop a clear picture of what's happening and go forward with the right responses. Something as simple as that we need to see happen.
Okay. And I just want to make sure it's on the record, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Elvis,
as a parliamentarian,
I'm sorry, it's no longer your turn to speak. I'm sure there'll be time for debate and other matters in the future. And of course, we're making that important distinction. We're now on to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses. I am a big fan of Amnesty International and have actually been a member for many, many years. You do such great work, and thank you very much. Please keep it up. You know, the government of Canada has already characterized China's national security law for Hong Kong as a violation of international obligations. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs, François-Philippe Champagne, has announced that going forward, Canada will not distinguish between Hong Kong and China concerning the exportation of sensitive goods and will not permit the exportation of sensitive military items to Hong Kong. Canada is also suspending its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. So in your opinion, Mr. Neve, what impact would these measures have on the situation in Hong Kong and on Canada's relationship with China? And also, what exact additional steps could the government of Canada take, in your opinion, to help safeguard Hong Kong's autonomy and political freedoms and to support those that are seeking to advance democracy in Hong Kong? I know that is a packed question, but our time is short.
Well, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have an exchange with an Amnesty member. Yes, I mean, the steps that Canada has taken so far matter and are welcome. I think all of us in some way or shape or form referred to the suspension of the extradition arrangement, the tightening of controls on military and other sensitive transfers, and have noted, for instance, that this question of Magnitsky sanctions is in play. And all of that does matter, and we should continue to be exploring what more we can do, even just on a bilateral basis. I guess I would come back to the point I've been trying to stress, that I think much of Canada's value added is to really pursue those kinds of measures and others in multilateral ways. If anything is going to start to build pressure on China, it is for the chorus of international concern to become not only the same countries time after time, but a broader group and a larger group. And Canada, I think, has some real strength to offer on that front. I would, in terms of very concrete measures, I guess I would highlight, perhaps in my list of 5, the 2 that are maybe the most immediate and concrete are the recommendations I highlighted with respect to the refugee situation, readying for the fact that there may be an increased number of individuals looking to Canada for refugee protection, being prepared to do so ourselves, but also readying an international response if those numbers really become high. And then secondly, the concerns about what's happening here in Canada to activists who are receiving threats.
Right. Thank you. I know the government of Australia has announced new visa arrangements, extensions with a pathway to permanent residency for Hong Kong passport holders who have temporary skilled visa or a graduate visa. And the government of the United Kingdom has created a new immigration mechanism to allow about 2.9 million British national overseas citizens from Hong Kong to apply for a visa of up to 5 years. And after that, they can apply for settled status and then naturalization, which sounds extremely good to me. But what is currently known about the number of democracy activists and political figures who may be seeking to leave Hong Kong? And will they be allowed to leave, or are their passports being taken away?
I wonder if Sophie may have more insights on that front than I do.
It's difficult to have numbers or have lists. I mean, these are decisions people are making very quickly and under duress, and often with discretion. I can share with you that we have encouraged people we know who are seeking shelter to contact a set of governments who we believe will mobilize quickly to assist them, and that does include Canada. But if I can add one other quick point on the issue of exports and sales and what to restrict, we've done quite a bit of work about abuses of surveillance technology across China in the last few years, biometrics, AI, you name it. And I think it really is incumbent on governments who are concerned about these issues to think about limiting any of the exports of technology or services that enable rights abusing surveillance, and to look very carefully at the kinds of research partnerships or investment made by Chinese companies or institutions inside Canada with either academic institutions or simply as a vendor of products and services. I think there's much to do there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richardson, and thank you, Ms. Zan. Now on to Mr. Jenis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I wanted to start by echoing what Mr. Alba said in this sense on hostage diplomacy, that I think if we go down the road of considering policy concessions in response to hostage diplomacy, then we just invite the massive expansion of that hostage diplomacy, and we also limit our ability to ever do anything that's contrary to Chinese state interests. So I would really encourage members of the committee, let's make decisions about what is right and what's in our strategic interest, and let's protect ourselves and not be victims to this kind of hostage diplomacy calculation. And Mr. Neve, I was very struck by your comments about government inaction around foreign state interference, and I look forward to the written follow-up on that, and I hope we as a committee are able to study that issue further and come out with specific recommendations. And I know it's an issue that other committees, maybe the Public Safety Committee, but also the Intelligence Review Committee have taken up as well, this issue of foreign state interference and how that impacts Canadians and the response. I wanted to ask on the immigration piece of this. I'm very concerned that there is a risk that the Chinese state will take action to try to prevent immigration and take action to try to prevent the unification, the return to Canada of Canadian citizens. and we've already seen some noises in this direction in the case of UK government policy and the response from China. What do you think the likelihood of that is? And as we call on the government of Canada, as we have called on the government of Canada to have a plan for facilitating the reunification of Canadians, as well as dealing with the asylum piece of this, what could China do, and what could Canada do in response to ensure that reunification and asylum can actually take place in response to countermeasures? So maybe Ms. Richardson, if you start, and then we'll go to the other two after that.
Sure. Well, maybe on the point about what to do to protect citizens, the Chinese government doesn't recognize dual citizenship. And as a practical matter, I think probably the most urgent thing to do is assess on what status dual citizens are in Hong Kong, meaning if they've entered on their if they've entered Hong Kong or they're in Hong Kong on their Hong Kong status rather than their Canadian status. I don't know what mechanisms are available to change that, but at least it gives the Canadian government a slightly superior claim to those people and defending their interests. And I think making very clear to Beijing that any efforts to deny people the ability to leave or reunify with family members would be an issue of the highest concern. Because let's recall, the Chinese government has detained and held for decades people who are citizens of other countries and simply refused to acknowledge their citizenship and therefore the ability of representatives of those other governments to have access to them.
Yeah, just to zero in on that. So you do think that there is a reasonable risk that the Chinese government could, on a widespread scale, seek to prevent Canadian citizens in Hong Kong from returning home, especially if they travel on their Hong Kong status?
It's hard to predict, but a few senior officials have floated that idea, perhaps to test the response. And I think that's why an unambiguous response is important. And if you look at the track record of how other dual nationals the Chinese government wants to control have been treated, the signs aren't great.
Yeah. Okay. And Mr. Neve, your comments on that, please.
I was going to make some of the same points that Sophie has made, and I think maybe what I would add is that given this backdrop of concern about China's unwillingness to recognize dual nationality, and of course we see it in Hussein Khalil's case now for 16 years or 14 years, I think one of the real concerns is that you add to that an overlay of arbitrariness, and the very real concern is that it may well be the dual nationals who are at the greatest risk, who are the ones least likely to have their Canadian citizenship recognized, and there may be others around whom there's not a lot of political or other interest who would be able to leave fairly smoothly. So there's going to need to be a very sophisticated and multi-layered and multilateral, there's that word again, strategy here.
Thank you, Mr. Karam. In the time left, do you want to briefly weigh in on that?
Sure.
15 seconds.
Okay. I think it is quite important to take some actions because I'm afraid if it's a risk later, the risk will turn to threat by the CCP. We don't want to see thousands of Michaels being hijacked and then stay inside either Hong Kong or mainland China to use as a leverage to continue to serve for CCP's own political ambition and geopolitical strategies, which will in the end create some threats to the freedom and democracy in Canada as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karaman. Thank you, Mr. Dennis. Mr. Dennis, your time is up. Thank you very much. We're on the next 5 minutes. I think it's going to be shared by Ms. Yip and Mr. Dubois, I understand. Ms. Yip.
Thank you for coming and speaking so clearly on human rights. And yes, I will be sharing my time with Mr. Dubois, and anyone can answer my questions. Regarding the national security law arrests of student activists over social media posts, Amnesty International's Asia Pacific Regional Director Nicholas Bequillan said that 4 young people could potentially face life imprisonment on the basis of some social media posts lays bare the draconian nature of the national security law. The idea that anybody can now be jailed for expressing their political opinion on Facebook or Instagram will send a chill throughout Hong Kong society. So we're learning that these students have had their computers and phones seized, and under this new law, they can be compelled to answer questions. Can you comment further on the reach of this law and the risk it poses for freedoms of Hong Kong citizens? And also, will this mute and halt the momentum of protests?
Well, I think the reach is far-reaching, and it is exactly in its purposely vague terminology that scenarios such as the one that we've spoken to in that press release are playing out. This is not just predictions as to what might happen. This is actually how things are playing out. And I guess the one thing I would highlight is, while of course we're deeply concerned because of what has happened to those 4 individuals, and Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and other organizations will certainly be following closely. I think equally, we're very concerned about what we often refer to as the chill that unleashes. That it's not only the penalties and punishments that are going to follow for 4 individuals here, it's the thousands and thousands of others who will self-censor, who won't share their views on social media, who won't display public banners because they've heard about what happened to those 4, and they're just very, very fearful. And that is the overarching, really, intention of this kind of an initiative.
How can Hong Kong still show their dissent? It's going to be difficult.
I think some of the most evocative gestures since the law went into effect were things like people going out onto the street or members of the LegCo holding up blank pieces of paper as a gesture to say, we're speaking and we're not going to use the very words that might get us arrested, but we're not going to pass up the opportunity to make this gesture. I also want, very quickly, tying a few threads together, to remind this group that we wrote last year about one of your colleagues, MP Jenny Kwan, whose own WeChat posts about the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests were censored.
So just going on another limb here, can you tell us about the status of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants seeking to exit Hong Kong at this time, including the difficulties or barriers they may face? Is there a risk of them being arrested under this new law while trying to leave Hong Kong? Ms. Richardson?
Yes, we don't have particular figures of how many people are trying to leave, but I think people are, if I may speak very broadly here, are forced to make some very difficult calculations about how the law is going to affect their lives, whether leaving might draw unwanted attention to family members who remain behind, whether they have the means to emigrate, what they would go do in some other country. I think it's also often a very difficult choice for people to decide to claim asylum as opposed to try to find some sort of status that keeps open the door to being able to return if that's desirable for whatever reasons. And I think in that sense, some of the points that Alex made earlier about clarifying what opportunities are available to people, what status is on offer, what could be expedited, whether it's a one-way street, essentially, would be extremely helpful in people thinking through the trade-offs that they're going to make.
Thank you.
We have only, nous avons seulement 30 secondes, Mr. Dubourg.
We only have 30 seconds, Mr. Dubourg. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, listen, in 30 seconds, first of all, I would like to salute our witnesses and thank them for their valiant job. But Mr. Neves spoke about the recommendations that in the preceding panel we saw people telling them what threats they are receiving, but we were also told about the cabinet level position. Unfortunately, Mr. Dubois, I'm sorry, but there is no time left for an answer, but I have to conclude and proceed to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mentioned that earlier. We've seen the incarceration of journalist Mr. Lai, first of all, which is very concerning. We saw previously the called web corporations, the Googles and others who had reacted to the control in Hong Kong. Apple, for instance, had backed off. Facebook seemed to want to maintain its operations as is. Should we fear that beyond the control exercised by Chinese authorities on the various social media, we have to expect greater control over the coming days and weeks? And eventually, could we expect even more favorable terms by the various social agreements?
Translation.
Yeah.
Alex.
I didn't hear you commented, Sophie?
I was hoping that somebody who speaks French could answer that question. I don't speak French and I'm not getting the translation, so I'm not precisely sure what the question was asking.
Well, it's a concern about whether we're going to see more and more intensification of the crackdown through social media, Facebook, etc. And I think the short answer is yes. That's clearly one of the very specific intentions of having such a broad law as this. And I think we're already seeing that that some of the initial moves are absolutely going after people. The case of the 4 young activists that was highlighted in Ms. Yip's question, for instance, is about Facebook posts. We're going to see more and more of that, and it's very, very concerning.
I agree entirely with Alex on this matter.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Chair, I would simply like to mention that a lot of time was taken on my intervention concerning problems with the interpretation and translation, and I didn't think that you were going to take time from the response. I've added some 15 seconds. Approximately. I think that is equal to the time it took, so I tried my best to be fair to all. Pardon me.
Half minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to ask a general question to both Mr. Neve and perhaps the others. China, of course, has a terrible reputation for proper judicial system and for lack of fairness and respect for human rights generally. Are we dealing with something quantitatively different in the case of the special security law for China that requires special additional attention, or is it the behavior itself that's taken place that we need to be active about? And the second question, and then follow up on Mr. Neve's suggestion about the inadequate enforcement of laws within Canada for interference. Do we need a legislative response as well as getting the authorities to be more forceful in coordination of matters? Mr. Mulrooney, for example, has suggested a registry of foreign agents, etc. I'd care if you care to comment on that. That'd be appreciated.
I pushed the wrong way. With respect to the question about whether law reform is needed regarding concerns here in Canada, in the report that I'm going to be sending to you, that is one of the things we've signaled. The report didn't come down one way or the other as to whether a specific legal reform is needed. We did point to some examples from other jurisdictions, also including Australia, for instance, where there are laws beyond what we have in Canada that would perhaps open up greater recourse for individuals who have been through this. and therefore think that's worth exploring. With respect to whether this national security law is sort of a game changer or qualitatively different, I think it obviously is a game changer for the people of Hong Kong. But the backdrop is that on mainland China, national security laws have existed for a long time, and I think all three of our organizations have filled reports with all of the violations that stem from that.
I'll just add that the national security law in many ways is not sort of distinct if you're comparing it to other mainland laws. But let's recall that Hong Kong is a jurisdiction that has long enjoyed an independent, highly professional judicial system, protected the rights to a fair trial, had respected prosecutors, a reliable police, incredible police force gathering information. And a lot of that has began to change within the last couple of years, and the NSL really guts that system.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes remaining, and that goes to Ms. Alislev.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And my question is to Ms. Richardson, if you could, because I too find the cabinet level position suggestion really critically important. So could you give us some more specifics about what your concept is, and maybe even go so far as to give it a title so we can have a short form discussion about what that might be?
Well, I haven't gotten around to a title yet. I promise to follow up on that. But I think the idea really is reflected in many threads of our conversation here. We are no longer just talking about the human rights violations in Hong Kong or the threats that Uyghurs face or the challenges for civil society in China. We are also talking about the kinds of abuses that take place as a result of Chinese government policy or action in other countries, including Canada. And there isn't a focal point in the Canadian government or any other. Let me be clear, this isn't a criticism of Canada, and it's not a suggestion that we would only make to Canada. It's one that we'll be driving with a number of different governments. And I think especially for the governments that have incredibly complex, deep, thick ties, not just with the Chinese government, but themselves have communities of people who are of Chinese descent or people who are interested in China. I think governments have failed to recognize that those people are under threat and that there are other kinds of threats to people in their own countries as a result of Chinese government policy. And as Alex and Amnesty have very eloquently documented, and as we've experienced in taking up certain kinds of issues ourselves, it's very hard for somebody who's standing in Canada who is experiencing Chinese government harassment to figure out where they're supposed to go with that. And to sort of shrug or kind of pass the buck from one agency to the next is not a gratifying solution. And really, I think the failure to respond only encourages more of this kind of behavior. We've done a lot of work about universities in Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK, and their capitulations to Chinese government pressure, or it's probably more accurate to say their failures to stand by their principles of academic freedom and independence when there is significant Chinese government or state-owned enterprise money at issue, whether critical revenue streams that come in the form of international students from China are at issue. There's a lot of deferring and saying, well, maybe we'll work this out or the problem will change over time, which is, I think, generally the problem with lots of governments about their China policies over the last 20 years. That people have hemmed and hawed and hedged and not really grappled with the fact that this is a highly authoritarian, abusive regime that does not keep abuses at home, that is increasingly carrying out these operations overseas, including weakening the institutions that protect rights worldwide. So I would envision a petition that pulls all these threads together and looks at domestic, bilateral, and multilateral responses to all of these different kinds of problems.
So I want to explore that just a bit more. Would it be fair to characterize it in the sense that China certainly has a whole of country approach to achieve the objectives that they're trying to achieve through the national security laws, through the foreign interference, through the undermining of international multilateral institutions, And so that we then in return should also have almost a whole of government perspective where we're looking at it from a sovereignty, a security, an economic, an academic, a human rights lens, so that we have that central point of contact so that we can understand the integration and the interdependence of all of those things to understand how they're working in coordination. Is that fair?
I think you just wrote the job description. And look, you know, Beijing's is not a whole of government approach implying that it's merely a domestic matter. It's a whole of globe approach.
Fair.
And I think one of the most urgent needs for rights respecting governments in the coming few years is to map out for the coming decade at least, which is hard for democracies to do, how to present a counterweight to these threats rather than individual piecemeal, this government doing this, that one doing that. Sometimes things happening at the
And
Human
could I
Rights
say
Council.
that it's not only legislation, but also enforcement and policy and procedures and civilian and corporate attitudes and behaviors?
It's all of the above, and I have not yet written something on this. You're prompting me to commit to doing that.
Please
and
do,
sharing it
if
with
I
you.
could ask, and then of course table it back to the committee. And I sincerely thank you for all the research and homework you've already done.
And that's a very good way for us to conclude. I know that all colleagues would echo that and thank all the witnesses. We are very grateful to you for appearing today. Our next meeting will be at the same time on Thursday. Thank you all, colleagues, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.